The first thing you heard was the buzzing of flies, a dense industrial hum that drowned out the weak whispers and the muffled sobs. Then the smell hit you, not just antiseptic, but the sweet, cloying odor of decaying flesh and the metallic tang of blood-soaked bandages. Arkady Vasilyevich's world had shrunk to this one converted schoolroom, a place where he once taught children about the orderly laws of physics, now a temple to chaos and mortal entropy. He moved through the rows of stretchers not as a caregiver, but as a forensic investigator of a continuous catastrophe. His eyes were no longer a teacher's. They were scanners, capturing data points from broken men. A shattered leg aligned not with a simple fracture, but with a specific directional force, likely a mine blast at a 30-degree angle. A burn pattern on a torso spoke not just of fire, but of a fuel explosion with a distinct propagation wave. For 3 days, a single data point had been repeating, an anomaly in the noise, the word Panther. It was uttered not with general fear, but with a specific, frustrated hatred. A tank man, his face a mask of blistering burns, had clawed at Arkady's sleeve. "Our shell! It hit the flank. I saw the spark. It should have killed it. But it just kept coming, like we threw a pebble." Another, a young infantryman shivering with shock, had sketched a shape in the air. "It has a skirt, like a dress. Our bullet hit there, under the skirt, and then inside something cooked off." These were fragments, echoes in a chamber of pain. Until Sergeant Markov. Markov was a career soldier, a tank commander from the First Guards. His lower half was gone, swallowed by fire and metal. He was lucid, his mind clinging to clarity as his body drained away. His hand, when it found Arkady's wrist, was a cold vice. "Listen, educated man," Markov rasped, each word a death rattle he refused to surrender to. "I have seen all of them. The Panthers, the Tigers, this one, the Panther." It is a devil of geometry. Its front armor is a fortress wall, but its side— A bloody cough interrupted him. Arkady leaned closer, his entire being focused. "Its side is a lie. The armor is thick, yes, but it is shaped. There is a ledge, a vertical plate, then the skirt over the tracks. It creates a trap." Markov's eyes, glassy with pain, locked onto Arkady's. "My last shot. My gunner was dead. I fired the cannon myself. We were burning. It was a prayer. I aimed not at the hull, but at the join. Where the top of the track meets the belly, behind that skirt. A non-penetration hit, they would call it. A ricochet." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "The ricochet." It vanished under the skirt. 2 seconds later, the Panther's own ammunition erupted from within. It ate itself. He pulled Arkady so close the teacher could smell the death on his breath. The armor does not fail. The geometry betrays it. The angle is everything. Find the fatal angle, teacher. Find the chimney into hell." Markov died then, his final breath a sigh that carried the secret. Arkady sat frozen, the sergeant's cold hand still gripping him. The buzzing of the flies faded into a white noise. In his mind's eye, he no longer saw broken men. He saw vectors. He saw force diagrams. He saw a monolithic slab of German steel, not as an impervious whole, but as a complex puzzle of welded plates. A shell striking the main belt would defiantly ricochet away. But strike that lower junction, that specific sheltered corner where the side armor met the hull floor and was shielded by the thin, deceptive skirt. And the ricochet would not escape into space. It would be funneled, guided. Like a billiard ball shot into a corner pocket, the hard angles would capture it, redirect its remaining kinetic energy upwards into the tank's soft, explosive belly. It was not a weakness in material. It was a catastrophic flaw in design, a mathematical sin, a self-created kill box. Arkady gently pried the dead man's fingers loose. He stood up. The moans of the hospital, the smell, the oppressive heat, it all receded. A terrifying, crystalline clarity took hold. He walked, not to the next patient, but out of the hall, down the familiar corridor, now stained with blood and iodine. He pushed open the door to his old physics classroom. Desks were stacked high with medical supplies. The blackboard was cracked. But in the corner, under a pile of fallen plaster, was his personal cabinet. He tore the debris away, splinters digging into his palms. He unlocked it. Inside, untouched by the war, were his tools: a pristine geometry set, a professional compass, a roll of drafting paper, fine German pencils saved from a lifetime ago. He cleared a desk with a savage sweep of his arm, sending rolls of bandages tumbling to the floor. He unrolled the paper, anchoring it with a half-empty bottle of iodine and a spent artillery shell casing that served as a paperweight. He did not begin with words. He began with a line, a hard, vertical line representing the Panther's side armor. Then another, horizontal, for the hull floor. Then a diagonal, for the angled upper plate. He sketched the thin, deceptive skirt covering the tracks. His hand was steady, his movements precise, surgical. This was not a sketch of a tank. It was a blueprint for a massacre. He drew the trajectory of a standard shell, striking the main plate and ricocheting harmlessly away. Then, in red pencil, he drew a new line. A line originating from a low, oblique angle. It struck the junction, the precise intersection of the vertical plate and the horizontal floor, right behind the leading edge of the skirt. The red line did not bounce away. It turned, a lethal 90-degree pivot, and shot upwards, deep into the heart of the machine. Arkady Vasilyevich, schoolteacher of the 207th Secondary School, sat back. He stared at the red line. It was so simple. It was so obvious. It was a revelation written in geometry and blood. The greatest threat to the Red Army, a technological terror rolling across the steppe, had a fatal mathematical error in its blueprint. And he, with a dead soldier's last words and a pencil, had just found it. The hunt was over. The kill shot was now a matter of calculation. Darkness had fallen, but the small office was alive with a furious, contained energy. The single kerosene lamp cast a shivering globe of light onto the desk, transforming it into an island of terrifying clarity in a sea of war shadow. Arkady Vasilyevich was no longer a man. He was a conduit for a single, consuming purpose. The world outside, the distant thunder of artillery, the sighing of the wind through broken windows, ceased to exist. The diagram from the hospital was just the seed. Now it needed to grow into an unassailable truth. He attacked the problem not with emotion, but with a cold, systematic ferocity that would have frightened his former students. This was no longer about a tank. It was about proving a theorem of destruction. First, the evidence. He did not have intelligence reports. He had the whispers of the dying, and he treated them as empirical data. He began a new sheet, titled not with words, but with a carefully drawn table. Column 1. Witness designation, tankman, 3rd Company. Sergeant, anti-tank rifle, etc. Column 2. Description of impact. Column 3. Observed result. Column 4. hypothesized impact angle. He translated agony into coordinates, screams into vectors. Each memory, each fragmentary description, was a data point to be plotted. He cross-referenced them, searching for the convergence, the statistical heart of the weakness. The reports of a spark under the skirt and ammunition cooking off from below began to cluster around a specific zone on his master diagram. It was taking shape. But anecdote was not enough. He needed material proof. He remembered the front-page photograph in last week's Pravda, a grainy, triumphant shot of a knocked-out panther near Kursk. He found the crumpled newspaper in a stack for kindling. Under the lamp's magnifying glow, he ignored the bold headlines and stared only at the machine. The picture was poor, but he could see the rough shape. And there, on its left flank, just above the road wheels, was a dark, jagged stain. A penetration. Using a ruler and his knowledge of perspective, he estimated the location. It aligned with his zone. A jolt of electricity shot through him. This was not a hallucination. He began a new drawing. This was no longer a schematic, but a forensic reconstruction. He drew the panther in three-quarter view, not as an artist would, but as an engineer, with precise, clean lines. Then he started adding the wounds. From memory, from the photograph, from the soldiers' tales, he began to mark small, precise X marks on the tank's flank. One near the rear of the skirt, another on the forward drive housing, a third on the lower side plate. Seen individually, they were random battle damage. But as he placed them, guided by his geometric hypothesis, a pattern emerged with chilling clarity. The X marks were not scattered. They congregated like flies around the rotten spot, a tight cluster just behind the front road wheels, at the precise point where his red kill line terminated on his original diagram. The tank was telling him its own secret, spelling it out in scars. The abstraction was becoming real, and with that reality came a rising, ice-cold fury. This wasn't just a design flaw. It was a factory-installed death sentence for the crews inside. He calculated the angle of the side armor, the likely thickness he deduced from shell performance reports. He then took the ballistic specifications for the standard 45mm anti-tank gun, the weapon everyone said was useless against the Panther. He scribbled calculations in the margins, formulas for armor penetration, for angle of incidence, for kinetic energy loss on ricochet. The numbers, dry and academic, told a story of shocking violence. A 45mm shell striking the main plate would indeed crumple. But striking his spot at a shallow, oblique angle, the math showed it would not need to penetrate the thick vertical armor directly. It would strike the heavily angled lower glacis, or the joint, deflect downwards or sideways with its energy largely intact, and be funneled by the unforgiving steel geometry directly into the ammunition storage in the hull sponson, or into the thin belly armor. The tank's own strength created a ballistic channel, a lethal shortcut to its vitals. A profound, unsettling silence settled over him. The lamp flickered. On the desk lay two things side by side. On the left, the hospital diagram with its single damning red line. On the right, the new forensic drawing, the Panther's flank tattooed with a cluster of fatal wounds, the mathematical proof scrawled around it like an incantation. They mirrored each other. Theory and evidence had fused. He looked at his hands, stained with pencil lead and the iodine from the hospital floor. These were the hands that had graded homework, drawn perfect circles on a blackboard, demonstrated the laws of motion with a pendulum. Now, They had drawn a map to murder a machine. The weight of it was immense, but it was not a burden. It was a catalyst. The knowledge was no longer just his. It was a live grenade with the pin pulled. It had to be delivered. He carefully rolled the two key drawings together with the calculations. He did not reach for official forms or stamps. This was beyond bureaucracy. This was a direct transmission from the front line of observation to the high command of necessity. He took a fresh, clean sheet. At the top, he wrote, not with flourish, but with the stark, uncompromising clarity of a theorem, regarding a systematic vulnerability in the frontal arc side protection of the German TV Panther tank and proposed counter-tactics. He had the target. He had the proof. He had the method. Now he had to make the Red Army listen. The quiet of the night was shattered not by explosions, but by the absolute, deafening roar of a truth that could change the course of battles. The teacher had finished his lesson. The report was ready, and hell was about to be served with geometric precision. The report, a neat cylinder of lethal knowledge, felt alien in Arkady's hands. It was too light, too insubstantial to contain the monstrous truth it carried. Carrying it through the muddy, chaotic streets of the town felt like moving with a live nerve exposed. Every truck backfiring, every shout from a checkpoint, made him flinch. He was no longer just a teacher. He was a courier for a secret that could save thousands or get him vanished for daring to know it. His destination was not the distant, mythical Kremlin. It was the solid, imposing brick building that now housed the town commandant's office, formerly the district agricultural ministry. Sandbags lined its entrance. The smell of damp wool, boot polish, and stale tobacco replaced the scent of grain ledgers. The air here was thick with the bureaucracy of war, a different kind of suffocation. He was a speck of dust trying to enter the engine room. The waiting room was a study in controlled desperation. Officers with harried faces brushed past him. Typists clacked away with mechanical indifference. A peasant woman in a headscarf wept silently in a corner, clutching a folded paper. Arkady stood, feeling the rough wool of his coat, the smooth cylinder of his drawings against his chest. He was invisible, a civilian, a non-person in the machinery of the state. When he was finally ushered into the office of Commandant Major Grigorenko, the contrast to Arkady's lamplit obsession was jarring. The room was large, warm from a potbelly stove, dominated by a massive oak desk piled with triplicate forms and stamped orders. Grigorenko was a bull of a man, his uniform straining at the shoulders, his face a landscape of fatigue and entrenched skepticism. He did not look up from a logistics report as Arkady entered. Arkady placed the rolled drawings on the desk like a sacred offering. He began to explain, his voice too tight, too fast. He spoke of geometry, of angles of incidence, of ballistic deflection, of a critical vulnerability. He unrolled the main diagram, his finger stabbing at the red line, tracing the fatal ricochet into the Panther's belly. Major Grigorenko finally looked up. His eyes were not curious. They were flat, dull pools of administrative exhaustion. He listened for perhaps 60 seconds. Then, with a sigh that seemed to come from his boots, he reached out. But not to examine the drawings. He took the edge of the meticulous, hand-drafted schematic between a thick thumb and forefinger, as if it were a piece of soiled rag, and slowly, deliberately, pushed it back across the desk toward Arkady. "Comrade teacher," he said, his voice a low rumble of dismissal. "We have a front to hold. We have shortages of fuel, shells, and men. We have real intelligence from the GRU. We have real engineers in tank factories." He gestured vaguely at the air. "What you have are drawings, fantasies. A tank is not a geometry problem. It is 50 tons of steel that shoots back." Arkady tried to protest, to point to the cluster of X marks the calculations. But the evidence, the testimonies from the wounded. Testimonies from the wounded? Grigorenko cut him off, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. Men in shock see what they want to see. They need excuses for why they are lying there, and the German tank is not. My job is with reality, not theories. He picked up a rubber stamp and brought it down on a form with a definitive thwack. The conversation was over. "Take your drawings, comrade. Go back to the hospital. That is where you are needed. Leave the war to the soldiers." The words were physical blows. The meticulous logic, the blood-sourced data, the gleaming obvious truth, all of it was reduced to fantasies by a single, weary bureaucrat. Arkady stood, stunned. The rolled paper in his hand felt not like a weapon, but like a childish toy. Humiliation, hot and sharp, washed over him, followed immediately by a colder, more terrifying emotion. A crystal-clear understanding of the wall of indifference he faced. He stumbled out of the office, past the clattering typewriters and the weeping woman. The cold outside air did not revive him. It sealed the failure. He walked, not seeing the streets, the portrait of Stalin on a banner, the columns of trucks. Grigorenko's words echoed, "Leave the war to the soldiers." The soldiers were dying because of the very thing he held in his hand. He found himself not at home, but on the outskirts of town, where the road turned to a churned-up bog of mud and vehicle tracks. A column of T-34s, their engines snarling, their crews haggard and grimed with oil, was rumbling forward toward the distant rumble of the front. He watched them, these real instruments of war. He saw a young tank commander, perhaps the age of his best former students, staring ahead, with hollow eyes, from his hatch. That boy would meet a Panther. He would aim at its imposing silhouette, and his shell would likely bounce. And he would burn. In that moment, the humiliation curdled into something else, a searing, personal rage. This was not an academic snub. This was a death sentence, signed in triplicate and stamped with bureaucratic approval for that boy in the tank, for Sergeant Markov, for all of them. The major saw paper. Arkady saw the ghost of a future explosion behind the eyes of every soldier headed to the line. The failure was not in the theory. The theory was perfect. The failure was in the delivery. He had approached the machine the wrong way. He had given them a scientific paper when they needed a weapon manual. He had spoken the language of angles when they only understood the language of orders and results. He turned away from the column, his back straightening. The rolled drawings were no longer a childish fantasy. They were a manifest injustice. Grigorenko had not broken his resolve. He had forged it in the fire of contempt. The path of official channels was closed, sealed with a rubber stamp. So be it. There were other paths, darker, more dangerous paths that bypassed the majors of this world and went straight to the heart of the beast. The teacher had learned his first brutal lesson of the war. Truth meant nothing without the power to force men to listen. Now, he would have to find that power, even if it meant stepping into the shadows. The knock on the door of Arkady's communal apartment came not at night, but in the flat gray light of late afternoon. It was a sound that did not belong, not the hurried tap of a neighbor, nor the heavy thump of a courier. It was 3 precise, measured raps that seemed to drain the warmth from the cramped, shabby room. A silence followed, deeper than before, as if the very air was holding its breath. Arkady opened the door. 2 men stood in the dim hallway. The one in front wore the olive-green uniform and blue cap of the NKVD, his face an impassive mask of authority that seemed carved from pale stone. Behind him loomed a larger, younger man in a greatcoat, his hands clasped formally, his eyes scanning the corridor with bored vigilance. The smell of cheap wool and cold leather invaded the space. "Arkady Vasilyevich Semyonov?" The officer's voice was quiet, devoid of inflection. It wasn't a question. A cold wire tightened around Arkady's chest. He nodded, unable to form words. From the corner of his eye, he saw his wife, Olga, freeze by the small stove, a wooden spoon hovering over a pot of thin soup. The faces of their 2 children, peeking from the back room, vanished instantly, swallowed by the shadows. "Major Semyonov," the officer stated, producing a small, leather-bound identification folder. He did not smile. "We must discuss your report. May we enter?" It was not a request. Arkady stepped back, the movement clumsy. The 2 men entered, their presence making the room shrink dramatically. Major Semyonov removed his cap with slow deliberation, revealing neatly parted hair. His eyes, a washed-out blue, performed a slow, invasive inventory of the room: the cracked plaster, the threadbare curtain dividing the space, the small shelf of books, the corner desk where Arkady's drafting tools still lay next to a half-finished diagram, a new iteration of the Panther's flank with more precise ballistic arcs. Semyonov's gaze lingered on the diagram for a second too long. Then it swept to Olga, who stood rigid, her knuckles white around the spoon. He gave a minute, formal nod that held no warmth. "You may wait outside, comrade," he said to the larger man, who silently exited and took a post in the hallway, his back to the door, blocking it. The message was clear. There was no leaving. "Your report to the military commandant was unusual," Semyonov began, turning his full attention to Arkady. He did not sit. He stood in the center of the room, a pillar of state power, in a space of private fear. A civilian, a schoolteacher, submitting detailed technical analysis of enemy heavy armor, with recommendations for tactical deployment. He paused, letting the absurdity of it hang in the stifling air. "Where did you obtain the precise dimensional data for the German TV tank?" The question was a trap, laid with perfect bureaucratic neatness. Any source he named, wounded soldiers, a photograph in Pravda, would be insufficient, suspicious. I estimated. Based on comparative analysis and observable features," Arkady heard himself say, his voice sounding thin and reedy. "Estimated." Semyonov repeated the word as if tasting something sour. "You are not a design engineer. You are not attached to military intelligence. Yet you produce engineering drawings." He took a single step toward the desk, his polished boot creaking. He picked up the compass, holding it delicately between his fingers. Fine German instruments, a rare thing nowadays. The implication dropped into the room like a lead weight. Olga let out a small, choked sound. "My father was an architect. He bought them before the revolution," Arkady said, the truth sounding like the flimsiest of lies. Semyonov placed the compass back with a soft click. He turned, his eyes now drilling into Arkady's. "Comrade Semyonov, Your initiative is noted. However, your actions demonstrate a severe lack of political consciousness. Disseminating unverified technical speculations can sow doubt. It can undermine the confidence of our soldiers in their equipment and their commands. His tone was that of a pathologist, listing symptoms. It is, at best, a dangerous distraction. At worst, it borders on the dissemination of panic. Where did you intend to send this theory next? The real question, the only question, was finally out. This was not about the Panther. This was about control. About a citizen stepping out of his assigned lane. Arkady's mind raced, a rat in a tightening maze. He thought of the rolled copy of the report hidden under a floorboard, his intention to send it to the People's Commissariat of Defense in Moscow. To confess that now would be suicide. I have sent it nowhere else. The commandant was the final authority, he lied, the taste of copper in his mouth. Major Semyonov studied him for a long, silent moment. The only sounds were the faint bubbling of the soup and the ragged pull of Olga's breathing. I believe you, Semyonov said finally, and the words were more terrifying than an accusation. But belief must be supported by action. You will cease this activity immediately. All notes, diagrams, calculations are to be surrendered. You will speak of this to no one. Not to your colleagues at the hospital, not to neighbors, and especially not to any more military personnel. Your duty is to the wounded. Confine your expertise to bandages and bedpans. He took a final look around the impoverished room, his gaze a verdict. Consider this an official warning, a notation. The next conversation will not be conducted in your home with your family present. It will be conducted at Lubyanska Street, too. Do you understand the distinction? The address was a phantom punch to the gut. Everyone knew what it was. The center of the iceberg. Arkady could only nod, a stiff, mechanical jerk of his head. Good, Semyonov said. He placed his cap back on his head, aligning it perfectly. The motherland values the service of all her citizens, in their prescribed roles. Good day. He turned and left. The large man fell in behind him. Their footsteps receded down the wooden hallway. The door stood open, a rectangle of chilling gray light. For a full minute no one moved. Then the soup boiled over with a hiss, snapping Olga into motion. She rushed to the stove, her movements frantic, tears streaming silently down her face. From the back room, a child began to cry softly. Arkady remained rooted to the spot. The cold that had entered with Major Semyonov did not leave. It had seeped into the walls, the floor, into his bones. The triumph of discovery, the fury at Grigorenko's dismissal, all of it was crushed under the absolute, quiet weight of the state's boot. They had not debated his geometry. They had neutered it. They had made him smaller than a man. They had made him a threat to be managed, a noise to be silenced, and they had done it in front of his terrified family. He looked at Olga's shaking shoulders, heard his child's muffled sob. The rolled drawings under the floorboard were no longer a weapon. They were a landmine planted beneath his own home. The hunt for the Panther's Flaw had just collided with a far more immovable object, the machinery of fear. And for the first time, Arkady Vasilyevich truly understood the cost of knowing something the world did not want to hear. The knowledge itself had become a prison. The silence after the NKVD's departure was not empty. It was a solid, suffocating entity that filled the communal apartment. Heavier than the furniture, thicker than the poor coal smoke from the stove. It was a silence, policed, by terror. Arkady stood frozen in the center of the room, his wife Olga's frantic scrubbing at the spilled soup. The only movement, a desperate pantomime of normalcy that screamed of panic. The major's words were not a warning. They were a surgical incision. Lubyanska Street, 2. The address was a psychic tumor now growing in the mind of everyone in the apartment. He could see it in the terrified dart of Olga's eyes as she glanced from him to the children's room, in the way his neighbor, Old Man Petrovich, suddenly found urgent business in the corridor, avoiding Arkady's gaze entirely. The news had already seeped through the thin walls. He was no longer Arkady Vasilyevich, the teacher. He was a source of contamination, a man touched by the blue caps. Olga finally stopped scrubbing. She turned to him, her face pale, her eyes wide and liquid, with a fear far deeper than any caused by distant artillery. This was the intimate personal fear of the knock, of the vanished husband, of the family left to scavenge and shame. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her entire being was a plea. Stop. For us. Be small. Be invisible. Arkady looked from her to the closed door of the children's room. Behind it, his son and daughter were hiding, likely under the bed, trying to mute their own breathing. They had been taught the game of quiet. His family had become hostages to his own mind. He gave a single stiff nod to Olga, a surrender. He walked to his desk, the site of his intellectual rebellion. With funereal slowness, he began gathering the papers, the master diagram with the red kill line, the forensic drawing with the clustered X marks, the sheets of ballistic calculations. Each rustle of paper was deafening in the punitive silence. He did not look at them. To look would be to remember the conviction, the clarity, and that was a luxury he could no longer afford. He was dismantling a part of his own brain, brick by brick. He opened the small iron stove. A feeble warmth emanated from it. He took the first sheet, the original hospital diagram, the seed of it all, and held it over the ashes. His hand trembled. This was not paper. It was Sergeant Markov's last breath. It was the key to saving countless Markovs. He stood there, paralyzed, the cold from the open door warring with the heat from the stove. He could not do it. With a jerk, he pulled the paper back. He gathered all the sheets into a tight, square bundle. He crossed the room, his movements now deliberate, stealthy. In the corner, near his children's sleeping area, a floorboard was slightly warped, known only to him. Using a knife from the table, he pried it up. The gap beneath was dark, dusty, a cavity in the heart of their precarious home. He placed the bundle of papers into the darkness. It fit perfectly. He lowered the board back into place, tamping it down with his heel. It was no longer a hiding place. It was a coffin. He was burying the truth alive. For the next 3 days, Arkady performed the role of a broken man. He went to the hospital, his eyes downcast, his hands performing their menial tasks with robotic efficiency. He spoke only when necessary, in monosyllables. He avoided the eyes of the wounded tankers, fearing his own knowledge would scream out of him. He was a ghost, haunting his own life. At home, he was a muted statue, jumping at every sound in the hallway, his ears strained for the telltale rhythm of official boots. The pressure was not just external. It was a slow, chemical poison inside him. He saw the Panther not in diagrams, but in dreams, a sleek, predatory shape rolling over the endless steppe, unstoppable, while lines of young men, faces blurring into his students, into his son, marched into its fire. And he, Arkady, stood by with a shovel, silently burying the one thing that could stop it. The breaking point came on the fourth day. He was sent to help sort the belongings of the newly arrived wounded. In a stained and tattered rucksack, he found a small, charred notebook. It belonged to a dead junior lieutenant from a tank destroyer unit. Most pages were burned or blood-soaked, but one page, near the end, was intact. It was not a diary entry. It was a crude, frantic sketch, drawn in pencil that had dug deeply into the paper. A child's drawing of a tank. An arrow pointed at its side, at a specific spot near the front. Scrawled next to it, in jagged, hurried letters, was a single phrase. "Achilles' heel? Hit here. Tell them." Arkady stared at the page. His blood turned to ice, then to fire. This was not his calculation. This was a battlefield epiphany, scribbled in the mud and terror of combat, by a boy who had seen the same terrible truth and died before he could tell anyone. It was independent corroboration from beyond the grave. The lieutenant's arrow pointed to the exact same lethal junction. The coincidence was a cosmic slap, a verdict. He had been an arrogant fool to think the discovery was his alone. The flaw was real, it was observable, and it was killing people while he, the one who had mapped it with scientific precision, was hiding it under a floorboard to save his own skin. A tectonic shift occurred within him. The fear of the NKVD, the terror for his family, did not vanish. It was suddenly dwarfed, made insignificant by the colossal, crushing weight of his cowardice. He had traded his moral spine for the illusion of safety. He was not protecting his family by being silent. He was condemning other families, other fathers and sons, to the fire. Sergeant Markov's last breath, the dead lieutenant's final scrawl, they were not requests. They were commissions, and he had failed them. He walked home that evening through the muddy twilight, a different man. The oppressive fear had been burned away, replaced by a terrifying, absolute calm. He was no longer afraid of Major Semyonov. He was afraid of the man he had become in Semyonov's shadow. Back in the apartment, he waited until Olga and the children slept, their breaths shallow in the dark. He moved with a thief's silence. He pried up the coffin floorboard. He retrieved the bundle of papers. They were not just drawings anymore. They were a testament and an indictment. He would not send them through channels. Channels were guarded by Grigorenko's and Semyonov's. He had to bypass the machine entirely. He had to find a way to scream so loudly that someone with real power, someone beyond the petty fiefdoms of fear and indifference, would have no choice but to hear. The hunt was back on. But the hunter was now an outlaw in his own country, and his prey was no longer just a German tank. It was the suffocating silence that protected it. The stakes had just been raised to the highest possible level. His conscience against the state. The decision ignited a cold, focused furnace inside Arkady. The paralyzing fear was gone, burned away in the fire of his shame. What remained was the hardened, brittle steel of resolve. He was no longer a petitioner. He was a saboteur, preparing a single perfect act of intellectual sabotage. His weapon would not be a bomb, but a document so undeniable, so surgically precise, it would be impossible to ignore, impossible to bury. He could not work at home. The walls had ears, and the floorboard coffin was compromised. He needed a forge. He found it in the bombed-out shell of the town's small printing house. Its roof was partially gone, open to the cold stars, its walls scorched by fire. The heavy lead type was melted into grotesque sculptures, the printing press's silent hulks of dead machinery. It was a tomb for words, and in its corpse he would resurrect his own. He worked only in the absolute darkness of the moonless hours, guided by a small, shuttered carbide miner's lamp that cast a stark, focused beam. The cold was a brutal physical presence, seeping through his layers of clothing, frosting his breath. He welcomed it. It was cleaner than the stifling fear of his apartment. Here, in the ruins, he was free. His first task was to transform his discovery from a theory into a field manual. He began with the dead lieutenant's notebook sketch. He carefully recreated it, but with the full, merciless precision of his geometry. The childish arrow became a detailed cross-section, showing the path of a shell, from muzzle to impact on the lower glacis plate, to the deflected ricochet tunneling under the skirt, into the ammunition rack. He labeled every component with chilling clarity. Primary impact zone, ricochet channel, vulnerable ammunition storage. But a diagram was not enough. The soldiers needed a rule they could understand in the chaos of combat, a simple mantra. He distilled his complex calculations into one brutal, actionable sentence. He wrote it in large block letters, a headline for death. Do not aim at the side armor. Aim at the base of the frontal plate where it meets the hull, just above the first road wheel, from a flanking angle of less than 30 degrees. It was a sniper's instruction for killing a dragon. He knew, however, that words and diagrams might still be dismissed as fantasy by the Grigorenkos of the world. He needed irrefutable physical proof. He remembered the Pravda photograph. He needed more. Over 2 torturous nights, he became a phantom in the archives of the town's propaganda office, a place left half-locked and neglected. He combed through stacks of newspapers, frontline bulletins, captured German leaflets. He was searching for corpses, and he found them. Not one, but 3 different photographs of knocked-out Panthers taken at different sectors of the front. In each, the quality was poor, the angles different. But his trained eye, now honed to a razor's edge, saw the pattern screaming from the silent images. In the first, a dark, jagged hole just above the front road wheel. In the second, the skirt plate blown outward, as if from an internal explosion low in the hull. In the third, the entire side of the tank peeled open like a sardine can, the tear originating from that same fatal junction. He carefully cut them out. These were not triumphs of Soviet arms in the propaganda sense. They were forensic exhibits. He arranged them around his master diagram, arrows pointing from the real-world wounds to the corresponding point on his schematic. The correlation was devastating. The theory was no longer theory. It was a pattern of mortal wounds etched in German steel across hundreds of miles of front. The final component was the most dangerous. He had to prove it was actionable with standard Soviet weaponry. Using the exact ballistic tables he had saved from his teaching days, and rough estimates of the Panther's armor hardness gleaned from wounded tankers' descriptions, he performed the calculations again. This time he formatted them not as academic notes, but as a firing table, a chart. At 300 meters, with a 45mm AP shell, aim here. At 500 meters, aim here. The humble Sorokopyatka, the weapon despised as useless against the new German cats, was given a new purpose. His math gave it a fang. On the 4th night, His masterpiece was complete. It was no longer a report. It was a dossier, a white paper on annihilation. The first page was the stark, instructional headline. The following pages were the layered proof, the cross-section diagram, the photographic evidence with its damning annotations, the simplified firing table. The text was concise, brutal, devoid of any personal plea or political language. It spoke only in the immutable dialects of geometry, physics, and empirical evidence. It was the ghost of Sergeant Markov and the dead lieutenant, given a voice of chilling, scientific authority. He rolled the final set of papers tightly. He had made 3 copies, one to bury in a new, deeper hiding place, one to be his weapon. The third, he hesitated. Then, with a steady hand, he addressed the outer wrapper of the second copy, not to an institution, not to the People's Commissariat of Defense. That was a bureaucracy, a black hole. He needed a name, a person with the power to act, reputed to have a mind technical enough to understand, and a will brutal enough to bypass the Semyonovs. He wrote the address he had only heard in rumors, a place where the scientific and military minds of the nation were forged together. And above it, he wrote a single, staggering name, a name that was a fortress and a verdict all its own. He was not sending a suggestion. He was launching a projectile. The casing was paper, the payload was truth, the target was the very pinnacle of the Soviet war machine. The schoolteacher from the ruins had just assembled a weapon of intellectual destruction, and he was now pulling the pin. The silence of the printing house cemetery was broken only by the whisper of the rolling paper and the hammering of his own heart, a drumbeat for a one-man war. Weeks bled into a tense, gray month. The silence that followed Arkady's act of postal rebellion was more terrifying than any knock. It was the silence of the void into which he had thrown his soul, waiting to see if it would ever hit bottom. He performed his life as an automaton, every creak of the stairwell, every official-looking figure in the distance, a potential herald of his end. The dossier was a phantom limb, its absence from its hiding place a constant, throbbing anxiety. Had it been intercepted? Had it been laughed at and tossed into a furnace by some faceless adjutant? Was Major Semyonov, somewhere in a gray office, patiently building a dossier of his own? Then the summons came, but not from the NKVD. It arrived via a young, crisp Red Army courier on a motorcycle, the envelope bearing the seal of the technical department of the main armored directorate. The message was terse, devoid of explanation or threat. Arkady Vasilyevich Semyonov was to present himself, with all relevant materials, to the commandant of the local rail station at 0600 hours the following day. Transportation had been arranged. The journey was a disorienting blur of blacked-out train cars, hissed conversations between officers he did not know, and landscapes stripped bare by war. He was neither prisoner nor guest. He was cargo of a specific, unexplained type. He clutched his small bag containing the original diagrams and his personal copy of the dossier, his palms permanently slick with cold sweat. The destination was not Moscow. It was a vast, brutalist complex hidden in a frozen birch forest, surrounded by concentric rings of fences and guard towers that bit into the iron-gray sky. This was a polygon, a military proving ground. The air here didn't smell of mud and decay, but of cold diesel, gunpowder residue, and hot metal. The sounds were different. Not the rumble of the front, but the sharp, authoritative cracks of weapons testing, the growl of engines on concrete pads. He was escorted not to an office, but to the edge of a vast, cratered field. A small observation bunker, its concrete still raw, housed a cluster of men. They were a different breed from Major Grigorenko. These men had the sharp, assessing eyes of engineers and the impatient bearing of front-line commanders. They wore a mixture of uniform tunics and thick leather jackets. None acknowledged him. He was a ghost, a specimen to be observed. In the center of the field, 200 meters away, stood a monstrous silhouette, a panther. Its German crosses were hastily painted over with red primer, but its form was unmistakable. The sloping glosses, the long barrel, the distinctive side skirts. It was a captured beast, chained and muzzled for this experiment. And facing it, at an angle, was the stubby, familiar shape of a Soviet 45mm anti-tank gun, the Sorokopyatka, a pop gun next to a dragon. A colonel with a face like granite and a clipboard barely glanced at Arkady. "You are the source of the geometric proposition." His voice was the grind of tank tracks. Arkady could only nod, his throat sealed shut. "The test parameters are derived from your document. Impact zone, angle of attack, range. We will fire 3 rounds. Observe." There was no ceremony. The gun crew, efficient and grim, went through their drill. The loader rammed home a shell. The gunner made minute-precise adjustments to the traverse and elevation. He was not aiming center mass. He was aiming low, at the specific, awkward junction where the Panther's lower front plate met the hull side, just behind the skirt's leading edge, the exact spot Arkady's red line had terminated. Arkady's heart stopped. This was it. The moment of brutal public validation or catastrophic, final humiliation. His entire being, his secret struggle, his terror, his guilt, all compressed into the next seconds. Ogone! Fire. The crack of the 45mm was sharp, almost petty against the scale of the target. A flash of light and smoke bloomed on the Panther's lower flank. A direct hit. For a horrifying second, nothing happened. The shell seemed to have simply splattered against the thick, angled plate. A few of the officers shifted, a low grumble beginning. The granite-faced colonel's jaw tightened. Then, a different sound. Not an explosion, but a deep, metallic clang from inside the Panther's hull, like a great bell being struck in a buried tomb. It was the sound of the ricochet, the shell, defeated by the primary armor, caroming with violent energy along the lethal channel Arkady had mapped. A heartbeat of silence. And then the Panther erupted from within. A jet of orange-white flame shot out of the driver's vision port, then the hull machine gun port. Secondary explosions, muffled but powerful, bulged the side skirts outward. A fireball, rich with burning fuel and ammunition, bloomed from the open commander's hatch, roaring into the cold air with a sound of furious consumption. The tank shuddered on its suspension, not from an external blow, but from its own guts being torn apart. It was being killed from the inside out, eaten alive by its own design flaw. The silence in the observation bunker was now absolute, profound, broken only by the crackle of the distant fire. The air, previously thick with skeptical tension, had been vacuumed out and replaced with awe and a kind of grim, professional satisfaction. The officers stared, not at the burning tank, but at the diagrams in their hands, then back at the physical proof melting before them. The colonel slowly lowered his clipboard. He turned his head, for the first time, to look directly at Arkady. There was no smile, no congratulations. There was the cold, absolute respect one gives to a proven law of nature. He gave a single slow nod. Arkady did not feel triumph. He felt a release so vast it left him hollow. The white-knuckle grip on his bag handle loosened. The image of Sergeant Markov's face superimposed itself over the burning tank, not in agony, but in something like peace. The ghost had been laid to rest with a thunderclap of vindication. The schoolteacher's equation had just been solved in fire and steel, and the answer was a roaring, undeniable truth. The flaw was real, the kill worked, and now the Red Army knew it. The return journey was a passage through a looking-glass. The same train, the same bleak landscapes, but Arkady Vasil'evich was no longer the same cargo. He carried no official commendation, no written order, no change in his status. The men on the train did not speak to him, but their silence now held a different quality. Not of dismissal, but of a wary, uncomprehending distance. He had been touched by something they could not categorize. A civilian who had spoken a truth so potent it made colonels nod in grim approval. He was an anomaly, and anomalies in their world were dangerous, even useful ones. He arrived back at his communal apartment as autumn tightened its grip, the air sharp and smelling of turned earth and distant smoke. Nothing had changed. The same cracks in the plaster, the same pallor of hunger on Olga's face, the same cautious, fearful glance she gave him, searching for signs of what the summons had wrought. He offered a small, weary smile, a signal, but not an explanation. The children clung to his legs, sensing a shift in the atmospheric pressure of their home, the easing of a terror they were too young to name but had breathed in daily. Life resumed its shambling, wartime rhythm. He returned to the hospital. The moans were the same, the smells identical. He changed bandages, mopped floors, held cups of water for new ghosts with old eyes. He was again Arkady the orderly, anonymous in his weariness. The colossal, fiery validation at the polygon existed in a separate universe, a secret shared only with the burning husk of a panther and the granite-faced men who had witnessed it. For days, he scanned the world for a ripple, a sign that his knowledge had escaped the proving ground and entered the bloodstream of the war. He listened to the wounded, but their stories were still raw, chaotic, of death and survival, not of new tactical doctrines. He saw no sudden shift, no grand announcement. A quiet dread began to seep in, the fear that his truth had been sealed in a vault, classified, studied, but not acted upon, another curious footnote for the archives while men continued to die. Then, a week after his return, Major Semyonov returned. He appeared at the hospital entrance, not in the wards, a solitary blue-capped figure cutting through the muddy yard. Arkady saw him through a window, and the old, instinctual cold wire tightened around his ribs. He watched, motionless, as Semyonov approached, his stride deliberate, his expression unreadable. This was it then, the delayed reckoning. The test had been a trick, a prelude to a deeper arrest. He braced himself, the ghost of the burning tank paling against the very real, very present machinery of the state. Semyonov stopped before him. He did not reach for Arkady. He did not speak immediately. His washed-out blue eyes performed their familiar invasive scan. But this time, they lingered not on Arkady's fear, but on his hands, still stained with iodine and cheap soap. Then, without a word, Semyonov reached into the leather map case at his side. He did not pull out handcuffs or a warrant. He pulled out a single sheet of paper, freshly printed, the cheap pulp coarse and gray. It was crinkled from folding and refolding, smudged with dirt and oily fingerprints. He held it out, not as an offering, but as a statement of fact. Arkady took it. His eyes dropped to the text. It was a frontline tactical bulletin, a pamyatka, a reminder for soldiers. The title was blunt: for anti-tank rifle teams and light gun crews, engaging the German TV, Panther. His heart stopped. He began to read, his eyes skimming over the standard descriptions of the tank, its strengths. Then he reached the core instruction. The words were different from his, stripped of his academic precision, translated into the brutal, imperative poetry of the soldier. Do not engage the frontal armor. Seek a flanking position. Target the lower side of the hull, immediately behind the front road wheel, at the point where the vertical plate meets the hull floor. Aim for the gap above the track skirt. Fire from an oblique angle. A penetrating hit here is highly effective. The world receded. The groans of the hospital, the presence of Semyonov, the cold autumn air, all dissolved into a white noise. He was staring at his own soul, translated into official doctrine. They had taken his geometry, his painstakingly mapped ricochet channel, his photographic evidence, and distilled it into a few lines of life-saving prose. They had given it to every anti-tank rifleman, every crew of a useless 45. He looked up, met Semyonov's gaze. The major's face was still an impassive mask, but in those pale eyes, Arkady saw no triumph, no contrition. He saw only a cold, professional acknowledgement. An understanding that the state's machinery, for all its capacity for terror and indifference, could also, when presented with an undeniable truth, metabolize it, weaponize it, and disseminate it without fanfare or credit. The system had used him as it used everything. It had absorbed his discovery, scrubbed it of his name, and sent it to the trenches to do its work. Semyonov gave a single, sharp, almost imperceptible nod. Not a salute to a hero. It was a transmission between two components of the machine, an acknowledgement of receipt and an indication that the matter was closed. Then he turned on his polished heel and walked away, his figure dissolving into the gray afternoon. Arkady stood alone, the dirty leaflet trembling in his hand. He felt no rage at the lack of credit, no patriotic swell of pride. He felt a profound, humbling, and immense relief. His fight was over. His truth had escaped. It had slipped past the Grigorenkos and the Semyonovs, past the bureaucracy and the fear, and had been stamped onto cheap pulp to be carried in the breast pockets of men heading into the inferno. He walked slowly back into the hospital, to the sink where the bandages soaked. He carefully smoothed the bulletin on a dry corner of the table, weighing it down with a bottle of antiseptic. He looked at his hands, then at the bulletin, then out the window at the wounded men being carried in from a newly arrived truck. The war outside would grind on, monstrous and hungry. But now, in some small, statistically significant way, the equation had changed. The Panther was no longer a mythical beast. It was a problem with a published solution. He picked up a fresh roll of bandages and turned to the next waiting soldier. The teacher's work was done. The lesson was in the field.